For Vladimir Putin, the blitz that was supposed to last days has hardened into a war of attrition measured in winters. More than 3.5 years after the full-scale invasion began on February 24, 2022, Russia still hasn't achieved its promised quick victory. The Kremlin trades lives and armor for muddy meters, while Ukraine keeps punching deep into the rear with a growing menu of long-range tools. That resilience isn't fueled by courage alone. It's underwritten by an expanding coalition that now stretches beyond NATO, from European rearmament to Indo-Pacific partners wiring money, policy, and industrial muscle into Kyiv's war effort. This isn't the isolated struggle Moscow imagined. It's become a global project to deny Russia its imperial win. Amid that coalition, one British weapon keeps reappearing like a plot twist the villain can't shake: Storm Shadow. After the initial deliveries in 2023 and subsequent batches through 2024 to 2025, the United Kingdom has sent additional missiles, quietly but deliberately, signaling not fatigue but commitment. London isn't just keeping Ukraine alive at the front. It's giving Kyiv the reach to make the Russian rear nervous. Command posts, depots, bridges, airfields, shipyard assets. The sinews that hold an army together. Each fresh consignment says the same thing in different words. We're still here, and we're still arming the long arm. The logic is brutally simple. In this war, range equals leverage. Where artillery saturates trenches, Storm Shadow sides at the depth, the arteries that keep those trenches supplied and coordinated. When Ukraine hits a headquarters or detonates a fuel farm hundreds of kilometers behind the line, the effects ripple forward. Slower planning cycles, longer supply timelines, diminished tempo. And Storm Shadow doesn't just arrive, it arrives cleverly. It flies low, compares what it sees to what was planned, and then drives a two-stage penetrator into the hardened places that were supposed to be safe. If concrete had feelings, Broach would hurt them. News first, then the anatomy of why it matters. In late October and the first week of November 2025, Britain resupplied Ukraine with an additional, undisclosed tranche of Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Bloomberg reported the delivery on November 3rd, describing a quiet resupply intended to sustain Kyiv's deep strike campaign into the winter months. The Kyiv Independent, ISW, and others amplified the same core facts, with all outlets noting the lack of disclosed numbers for operational security. The headline point is not in dispute: more Storm Shadows, timed for winter, numbers withheld. The quantity is secret by design. Since May 2023, when the UK first confirmed transfers, London has avoided announcing batch sizes or calendars. OPSEC isn't posturing. It complicates Russian counterplanning, preserves uncertainty around Ukraine's launch cadence, and lets results speak louder than press releases. The latest coverage follows that pattern exactly. Anonymous briefings on the fact of delivery, silence on the count. Translation: you'll know how many when the target pictures update. Multiple independent outlets beyond the initial scoop corroborated the timing and the rationale. Stockpile ahead of winter, when Russia historically intensifies strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and when logistics are most brittle. The Telegraph cited a source framing it as pre-winter preparation. Army recognition and regional broadcasters made the same point. This isn't charity by the calendar, it's a campaign plan. Load the magazines before the cold bites, then keep pressure on the depth while the front freezes. One reason the resupply matters this season is strategic gap filling. Kyiv's long-range wishlist includes US Tomahawk cruise missiles, but as of early November 2025, Washington's answer is not now. Newsweek reported President Trump ruling them out for now on November 3rd, even as reporting suggests the Pentagon assessed a transfer as technically feasible pending White House approval. In that grey zone, Europe's own deep strike option, Storm Shadow SCALP, becomes more than a stopgap. It's the backbone. What Storm Shadow is, in engineering terms, explains why Storm Shadow matters in political terms. It's an air-launched, conventionally armed deep strike weapon built for pre-planned attacks on high-value fixed targets, hardened bunkers, aircraft shelters, C2 nodes, critical infrastructure. It navigates by INS and GPS with terrain referencing, and then uses an imaging infrared seeker with automatic target recognition to match the terminal scene to stored imagery. In other words, it doesn't just fly to coordinates, it recognizes the door before it kicks it in. The payload is the Broach tandem warhead, a precursor charge to punch through, a follow-through charge to explode inside. Range is quoted publicly at over 250 kilometers, depending on variant, enough to put a troubling number of Russian assets within reach of Ukrainian Su-24M carriers. Those capabilities are not theoretical in Ukraine, they're historical. In September 2023, Storm Shadow strikes wrecked a Sevastopol dry dock, catastrophically damaging the Kilo-class submarine Rostov-na-Donu and the landing ship Minsk. Satellite imagery showed heavy damage. Ukrainian and Western reporting suggested the submarine was likely beyond economic repair. Days later, Ukraine struck the Black Sea Fleet headquarters in Sevastopol, forcing command functions to disperse and accelerating a broader Russian shift of ships away from Crimea to safer waters at Novorossiysk and the Sea of Azov. That combination, destroyed infrastructure, displaced command, rebased ships, is what strategic effect looks like when you don't own the skies. Fast forward to this autumn. On October 21st, 2025, Ukraine said it used Storm Shadow missiles in a combined strike against the Bryansk chemical plant inside Russia, a facility tied to munitions inputs. Reuters and Ukrainian outlets reported the claim, quoting the General Staff's assertion that air-launched Storm Shadows penetrated Russian air defenses. Moscow, as usual, disputed details, but confirmed damage at the site. Whatever the exact battle damage assessment, one truth stands. Storm Shadow retains the ability to reach and punish industrial nodes deep in Russia when policy authorizes it, and planning is tight. What these long-range strikes by Ukraine is time, disruption, and leverage. Time, because dispersed, relocated Russian headquarters take longer to plan and respond. Disruption, because rail hubs and fuel depots are not easily or quickly replaced. Leverage, because an army that can kneecap logistics 300 kilometers away bends negotiations, even without breaking the front. The missiles don't win the war alone, but they de-optimize the Russian system every day they fly, and they integrate neatly with other effects. Use Storm Shadow to break a door, drones to flood the room, and artillery to catch the responders. That's the playbook. None of this happens in a political vacuum. The UK's role here is larger than a single weapons transfer. It's a strategic through-line. On January 16, 2025, Prime Minister Keir Starmer signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine in Kyiv, a framework that reaches well beyond one winter's headlines into defence cooperation, maritime security, technology, and economic support. The agreement was published by the UK government and later ratified by Ukraine's parliament, which highlighted multi-billion-pound annual support lines running to 2030 to 31 and beyond. That's not a photo op, it's a political spine for years of assistance. The posture is backed by money and industry. In February 2025, the government committed to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, described as the largest sustained increase since the Cold War, with Treasury and Parliament research briefs outlining the glide path. On July 9, 2025, London and Paris went further, announcing the restart of Storm Shadow production and pushing the next generation Future Cruise anti-ship weapon into its next phase. Upgrades that keep the missile line alive and the skills base warm at MBDA. That pair of decisions, budget and production, turns a finite magazine into a regenerating pipeline. Back to the present. The latest shipment arrives under the traditional cloak of British OPSEC. Numbers are withheld, windows are vague, and confirmations are rare. That secrecy is not coyness, it's effectiveness. Every question mark on the spreadsheet is a question mark in a Russian air defense brief. Even coverage echoing the Bloomberg scoop reiterates the same caveat. London does not disclose quantities or schedules. The point is not to count missiles, it's to count effects. Predictably, Moscow has labeled the renewed deliveries escalation. The Russian Foreign Ministry blasted Britain on November 7th, part of a familiar script that tries to raise political costs for London while ignoring the legal reality that Ukraine is striking legitimate military targets in self-defense. The rhetoric will continue. but rhetoric doesn't rebuild depots or recompose scattered headquarters. For UK policymakers, the calculation has been consistent since 2023. Precision deep strike degrades Russia's unlawful war machine and shortens the conflict's runway. And if anyone doubts the cumulative effect on Russia's posture, look at the Black Sea. By July 2024, Ukraine's Navy chief publicly said that sustained missile and sea drone strikes had forced almost all combat-ready Russian warships to rebase from Crimea, neutering Sevastopol's historic centrality. Long-range missiles, including Storm Shadow, were part of that squeeze, complemented by uncrewed surface vehicles. The result wasn't a grand battle at sea, it was a strategic eviction notice, enforced one explosion at a time.
Zoom out further and you see how the UK's missile story links to a broader web.
While London retools industry and keeps the missiles flowing, partners outside the West have stepped in with their own forms of leverage. Japan signed a 10-year security pact with Ukraine in June 2024 and has since backed multi-billion-dollar support packages, including loans tied to the G7 program, leveraging proceeds from frozen Russian assets. South Korea, maintaining its policy line on direct lethal aid, indirectly backfilled US stocks with large tranches of 155mm shells, freeing up Western supplies for Ukraine. A wider democratic ring is learning how to share burdens, money, munitions, and politics for the long haul. There's an obvious question here. If Storm Shadow is so useful, why not send the American Tomahawk too? Kyiv has asked, and discussions have waxed and waned. But as of early November 2025, the US line remains that Tomahawks are not on the table right now. Reuters described positive talks on long-range systems this week, but the clearest on-record note is Newsweek's "for now, no," and multiple reports point to a White House decision pending or paused, despite Pentagon assessments that a transfer wouldn't harm US stocks. In that vacuum, the Anglo-French system becomes the practical solution at hand. The European long-range option that is flying today.
Technical interlude, because engineering is destiny in this fight. Storm Shadow's low-altitude terrain-following profile and IIR terminal seeker with ATR make it difficult to spoof with simple decoys or GPS tampering, particularly against fixed, catalogued targets. The Broach tandem warhead, designed specifically to defeat reinforced concrete, allows planners to count on structural penetration rather than mere facade damage. For a defender betting on thickness over adaptation, that's bad news. For Ukraine's targeteers, it's the difference between a warning shot and a funeral for a building. If you map how Ukraine uses Storm Shadow, a pattern emerges. Maximize payoff per shot. The missiles are expensive, the inventory's finite, and Russia adapts. So the aim is to pick targets with cascading effects, headquarters that coordinate multiple sectors, rail nodes whose disruption ripples across entire axes, naval facilities whose degradation forces fleets to move and stay moved. The Sevastopol dry dock strike was a textbook case, destroying scarce repair capacity while mauling key vessels, and the headquarters hit days later compounded the uncertainty for Russian command. When your enemy disperses and digs in because of your reach, their tempo slows before the first trench line changes hands. It's worth being honest about the trade. Deep strike is necessary, not sufficient. RUSI's 2025 assessment captured the nuance. Missiles like Storm Shadow have delivered significant tactical effects and shaped enemy behavior, but producing decisive operational collapse demands persistence and integration with other tools. That's why fresh deliveries matter less as headlines and more as habit. The sustained ability to impose costs in the depth, week after week, season after season. Back in London, the message has been deliberately consistent. The 2.5% defence spending path is paired with industrial moves to restart Storm Shadow production and accelerate the FCASW successor. Government releases spell out that MBDA's upgraded lines sustain hundreds of jobs. But the bigger story is capacity. More missiles, better cadence, tighter maintenance of know-how. This is what long wars demand. Not raids on the cupboard, but a working pantry. And for a coalition looking to outlast the Kremlin, a regenerating magazine is worth more than any single photo op. Russia, for its part, will keep calling each shipment escalation. That's become as predictable as winter snow. But every time the word is used, it becomes a little less persuasive.
because the legal and strategic context hasn't changed. A sovereign state is defending itself against aggression, using precision weapons to strike legitimate military targets. The UK's stance, equip Ukraine to impose costs on the machinery of war, is not a lurch, it's policy continuity. As one Turkish report summarized Moscow's latest complaint, the accusation lands, the missiles fly anyway, and the strategic balance shifts another inch out of Russia's favor. The first rule of Storm Shadow Club is that you don't talk about Storm Shadow Club. From the outset, the United Kingdom has kept a tight lid on the quantity and timing of its deliveries. And that isn't coyness, it's operational design. Ministers have repeated a consistent line in answers to Parliament. Yes, the United Kingdom has provided Storm Shadow. No, it will not disclose numbers or schedules for reasons of operational security. The logic is simple enough to brief in one sentence and live by for years. If Moscow doesn't know how many rounds are in the magazine, it has to assume the worst and defend accordingly. That uncertainty is a cost in itself. You can see the discipline in the public record. When the original transfer was announced back in May 2023, the Defense Secretary offered the strategic rationale, but not the inventory count. The same pattern holds in 2024 and 2025. Written answers, ministerial statements, and press guidance stress capability, not arithmetic. We know the missile, we don't count it out loud. And if that feels frustrating to the armchair analysts who just want a scoreboard, remember that silence over batch size often equals surprise at the target. Moscow, of course, fills the silence with noise. Each fresh report of a shipment is met with ritual accusations of escalation. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has made a small cottage industry of it, pegging British deliveries, especially those timed around Western debates on long-range weapons, as proof that London aims to inflame the conflict. The Kremlin's media apparatus then amplifies the charge, hoping to raise political costs for the UK. But there's a difference between accusation and effect. Rhetoric doesn't patch holes in dry docks or reassemble a shattered headquarters. The accusations extend beyond missiles to the money that helps buy them. When the G7 and EU moved to use windfall profits from frozen Russian sovereign assets to back loans for Ukraine, Russia's diplomats denounced it as theft. Western finance ministries replied that they were using proceeds, not the principal, and that international law allows the profits to service Ukraine's debt. That legal financial plumbing matters because it helps sustain packages like Britain's air defense missile support without emptying domestic coffers or diluting resolve. The Kremlin can rail against robbery. The receipts say otherwise. Behind the messaging war is an industrial math problem. Storm Shadow is a high-end, low-density munition. Stocks are finite, and firing rates must match both battlefield need and replenishment speed. The UK's answer in 2025 has been to pair donations with regeneration. In July, London and Paris agreed to acquire new Storm Shadow missiles, upgrading production lines at MBDA on both sides of the channel. That deal explicitly links Ukraine's battlefield success to European stock resilience. The missile proved its value, so the lines are being modernized to produce more. In plain English, the pipeline is turning back on. Replenishment is not purely a military affair. It's also an economic and political choice. The UK's commitment to lift defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 creates room in the budget to rebuild magazines while continuing to donate. It is easier to keep your promises to allies when your finance ministry is building a larger purse and your defence industrial base is scaling. Ministers have framed this as a national security dividend and an industrial strategy, becoming, in the Chancellor's phrase, a defence industrial superpower. Grand words, yes, but paired with cash, contracts, and a procurement glide path that outlasts one winter. There's also the question of how to fund specific items without raiding other priorities. Here, the UK has leaned into a novel mechanism, using interest from seized Russian assets to finance part of its Ukraine packages, including hundreds of ground-launched ASRAAM air defense missiles in mid-2025. It's not Storm Shadow, but it is a complementary capability that preserves domestic budgets while sending a pointed message. Russia's money will help pay for the systems that blunt Russia's attacks. In a long war, sustainable funding sources aren't a luxury. They're the difference between one more month and one more year of deliverable aid. Even with money and factories aligned, there's the hard reality of readiness. The RAF has its own strike requirements and cannot simply give away everything in the cupboard. That's why the acquisition of new Storm Shadow rounds for UK and French stocks matters so much. It lets London keep helping Kyiv without hollowing out its own ability to respond to crises. The National Audit Office has described this catalytic approach: donate key capabilities to unlock allied contributions, then replenish via joint procurement, as a way to square solidarity with sovereignty. The balancing act is deliberate. Support Ukraine robustly while maintaining the UK's strategic depth. On the battlefield, Russia adapts. Air defenses shift, decoys multiply, and electronic warfare thickens. That raises the cost per effect for every long-range munition, Storm Shadow included. The answer is targeting discipline and combined effects. Use the missile where its penetrating warhead and terminal seeker are irreplaceable. Hardened C2 nodes, vital depots, scarce repair docks. Then cover the gaps with cheaper drones and artillery to exploit the disruption. British planners know this. Ukrainian targeteers live it. The secrecy around batch sizes isn't just to frustrate Russian analysts. It's to manage a precious commodity within a combined arms playbook that must be sustained winter after winter. And then there's alliance management. Every Storm Shadow shipped is also a signal to partners who may be considering their own long-range contributions. With US Tomahawks explicitly not now as of November 3rd, 2025, London's persistence helps maintain Kyiv's deep strike baseline and nudges others, especially in Europe, to keep the pipeline open. Signaling in this sense is not Twitter, it's tonnage. The act of showing up with missiles in November says more than any communique. The final challenge hides in plain sight: time. Ukraine needs long-range punch not for one operation, but for a campaign that stretches across seasons. Winter slows maneuver, but it does not slow targeting. The secrecy protects tempo, the production lines protect volume, the budgets protect endurance. Tie all three together, and you get the same conclusion British officials keep hinting at. This isn't a sprint of spectacular moments. It's a sustained program to keep the Russian rear busy, off balance, and expensive to maintain. So what precisely do these shipments buy Ukraine as the winter of 2025 to 2026 arrives? First, continuity. Resupply in late October and early November means Kyiv can sustain a cadence of deep strikes rather than rationing shots and losing pressure. Continuity matters because the Russians have learned to recover. You don't win by one-off catastrophes. You win by forcing the enemy to live in recovery mode. When headquarters disperse and rail hubs work on shorter shifts, frontline operations slow, even if the snow already did half the job. Second, optionality. With Tomahawks off the table for now in Washington, Storm Shadow remains the European long-range workhorse, already integrated with Ukraine's Su-24M fleet. Options breed leverage. If you can hit a depot 300 kilometers away on Tuesday and a repair dock on Thursday, you create deep uncertainty for Russian planners about what will still be there on Saturday. And uncertainty, magnified across 100 staffs, is a weapon in its own right. Third, layering. Long-range strikes are most effective when paired with other tools arriving in theater. Ukraine now fields F-16s from European donors, expanding the airframe ecosystem that can protect launch platforms, cover egress routes, and eventually carry a broader range of munitions. Meanwhile, the United States' earlier transfers of ATACMS, both the mid-range type supplied in 2023 and longer-range variants confirmed in spring 2024, add complementary trajectories and target sets. Combine that with ground-launched ASRAMs, funded by interest on frozen Russian assets, and you get a layered air and strike network that is wider than any one missile. If the question is what comes next, part of the answer is more of the same, reliably. The UK front's decision to acquire new Storm Shadow rounds and upgrade production lines indicates a pipeline that can support additional tranches without depleting national stocks.
France's SCALP contributions already mirrored the UK's initial move, a phenomenon the NAO calls catalytic. Expect that catalysis to continue, especially if European leaders move closer to unlocking more windfall profits from frozen Russian assets for defense procurement. Incremental decisions add up.
Beyond quantity, expect qualitative changes. Targeting will likely prioritize nodes with cascading effects, transformer yards feeding military plants, rail and bridge choke points that move ammunition toward the front, and command complexes directing winter strikes on Ukraine's grid. We've already seen the template in Bryansk, where Ukrainian officials said Storm Shadows penetrated air defenses to hit an explosive-related plant. The lesson is that deep industrial nodes are fair game when policy allows and planning is tight. With each successful hit, Russia must choose between dispersal, which slows output, and concentration, which invites the next strike. That trade-off is the whole point.
At sea, the logic is similar. The Black Sea Fleet's retreat from Sevastopol did not happen because of one magic weapon. It happened because of persistent long-range pressure, including Storm Shadow, which made Crimea an expensive home port. Maintaining pressure on the fleet requires continued pressure on repair capacity, ammunition stores, and air defense nodes that shield berths and shipyards. Missiles designed to crack reinforced structures are tailor-made for this purpose, especially when paired with sea drones that harass what remains. Expect the Black Sea chessboard to remain hostile to any Russian plan that depends on the Crimean sanctuary. The industry will also shape the battlefield. The UK's effort to become a defense industrial superpower is more than a slogan if it keeps converting budgets into output. Missiles from MBDA lines, drones from expanded domestic suppliers, sustainment kits that matter when the news cameras move on. Reuters reporting in March outlined the Treasury's push to channel more funding into defense technology, with a carved-out share of the equipment budget for innovation. For Ukraine, what matters is that industrial tempo in Britain and Europe turns into reliable deliveries measured in months, not years. For Russia, it means that they will run out is no longer a strategy. At best, it's a hope. Diplomacy is evolving alongside industry. NATO has begun coordinating regular, large-scale arms deliveries, helping member states align shipments into predictable waves, even as the alliance itself maintains formal distance from direct combat. This choreography, paired with the G7's loan program serviced by asset profits, makes it easier for capitals to plan multi-year aid without budgetary convulsions. In that environment, British Storm Shadows become one stanza in a larger chorus, predictable enough to plan around, flexible enough to respond to the battlefield's rhythm. What about countermoves? Russia will continue to shift its air defenses, deploy more decoys, and experiment with electromagnetic tricks. None of that is new, and none of it is free. Every extra battery pulled back to protect a depot is a battery not covering the front. Every headquarters that is forced to split into multiple locations multiplies its communication problems and slows its decision-making loop. Deep Strike doesn't always produce headlines. Sometimes it just quietly steals time from the other side's day. Storm Shadow's IIR Seeker and Broach Warhead are designed for precisely that kind of slow, grinding leverage, forcing bad choices behind the lines until the front feels thinner than it looks. Somewhere, a Russian engineer is proposing two roofs as a solution to Broach. All of this adds up to a winter of deliberate pressure. Expect fewer, smarter salvos, combined effects that turn one explosion into a week of repairs, and a steady drumbeat of strikes that make planners in occupied territory look over their shoulders twice before turning out the lights. If you're keeping score, remember, movement at the front can be measured in meters, while momentum in the rear is measured in headaches. The United Kingdom's fresh deliveries are designed to maximize the latter until the former becomes easier to achieve. So the question for you, and for policymakers watching this unfold, is straightforward. What should come next to magnify the effect of these missiles? More Storm Shadow to keep the cadence high, expanded air and missile defenses to shield cities and airbases, faster industrial investment so Europe's long-range stocks regenerate as quickly as Ukraine can plan new target lists? Tell me what you think belongs at the top of the list, because in this war, pressure in the rear shapes progress at the front, and every month
that Britain keeps Ukraine's long arms strong is a month that Russia's war gets harder to sustain.